I wonder, do you have just sort of like a capsulized definition of what on earth epigenetics are and how they relate to ancestral healing specifically? Big question, I understand.
Well, epigenetics, is, take the word epi, means on top of, and genetics refers to our genes. So genes are basically sequences of a special kind of molecule called DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, that has certain what are called base pairs, like alphabets in our, like letters in our alphabet, right? So that you have different combinations that form the sequence of nucleotides or the base pairs in this double helix molecule called DNA. Now, the DNA has its impact on us from the nuclei of almost every cell in the body, except, of course, red blood cells, which don't have nuclei. But they are sequenced such that when RNA is made, single-stranded nucleic acid, ribonucleic acid, is made from the DNA, it then goes out of the nucleus of the cell and into the plasma of the cell, where ribosomes read off that RNA and make proteins, so that the sequence of DNA is turned into sequences of RNA, which is turned into sequences of amino acids, which are then forming the proteins that shape how the cell functions and even determine things like cell growth, for example. So any way you can control that process of a gene, a sequence of DNA, being turned into RNA and then protein, will affect the way the body functions, including, for example, how the brain grows and responds to the environment around it. So the way that a gene is expressed, gene expression, determines protein production and the way we experience different ways of being in the world. The way, excuse me, the way we understand this process is that on top of the genes, here's where the word epi comes from, on top of these sequences of DNA are non-nucleic acid molecules like histones or methyl groups, very relatively simple molecules that sit on top of the DNA. And the way it sits on top of this sequence of DNA called a gene changes the shape of this double helix molecule. And the way that shape is modified by these epigenetic molecules, these histones and methyl groups, then determines how, when, and to what degree the expression of those genes into RNA and then subsequently DNA, into protein, will happen. So the reason epigenetic molecules are so important is, number one, they shape gene expression, which is basically saying, if you were comparing this to a library, you have the book that was written, that's your genetic material. Then you have the librarian who determines whether the book is going to be on the shelf or in the front part when you check out, or puts it in a closet and says, no one's going to ever read this book. So it doesn't matter if a book is written, it doesn't matter if a gene exists, if it's never expressed, if it's never read. And so the librarians are not the books, they're the modulators of book expression, if you will. So the epigenetic molecules are equivalent to librarians that determine how, when, and to what degree a book will be read, a gene will be expressed. Now, that's one reason it's really important. The second reason is when you, and do you want this much detail? I want to make sure I'm not giving you too much.
Absolutely,
okay.
yes.
Okay, because I can go nuts about science. I love, love, love science. So, so now we know that when you have an experience in real time, let's say the way we might experience a stress, like a famine, your own cells will have a modification of the epigenetic regulators to allow you, for example, to process insulin in a different way based on the lack of food. And that's good. So epigenetic modulation happens to try to adapt to the circumstances you're in. To put it simply, experience in our lives changes epigenetic regulation of gene expression. That's number one, including what happens in the brain. But the second important part of this number two issue of experience changes epigenetic regulation is that depending on the timing, you can actually have the ovaries of a female who's in the womb when her ovaries are developing shape her eggs based on what her mother is experiencing, right? So a mother in a famine who's pregnant with a female fetus will have the fetus's ovaries change in response to the mother's experience. And then that female fetus coming out may not have her epigenetic changes in her body, but when she has a baby, male or female, that male or female will inherit, using that word meaning passing through sperm and egg, they will inherit the epigenetic changes of the grandmother. You see, so it could even skip a generation if it's a female, but if it's a male, let's say, for example, in the Holocaust, who's just before adolescence when his sperm are maturing in the testicles, he can get the epigenetic changes based on being in the threatening experience of a Holocaust, may shape his developing sperm if he's like 10 or 11. And then when he has a child, that child will inherit the father's adaptation to what he went through. And so the epigenetic changes are passed through egg and through sperm, so that you do inherit literally epigenetic modifications on the top of your genes. So you're not changing gene sequences as far as we know. You're just changing the regulation of gene expression. So for example, for a famine, what the studies suggest is you're going to modify the way you process food, so you hold on to calories more, make it more likely that you'll be obese and develop diabetes. If your grandparent, in the female case, had experienced a famine, or in the Holocaust case, you may have actually a vigilance for danger with intense anxiety and fear that is epigenetically manifest in your brain because of this process. And sadly, there's even a study by Michael Meany of people who had committed suicide, those who had been abused in childhood and those who had not been abused in childhood, both had completed suicide. They did biopsies of the brain, and the epigenetic changes in areas that regulated the response to stress were only found in those who were abuse victims. So that shows that a child who's directly experiencing abuse will have epigenetic changes in their brain to make it so that they're more vigilant for danger, so the stress response is more intense. And that was a very painful but important study to suggest that early childhood experiences can also change the epigenetic regulation to make it so it's even harder for you to deal with stressors. And so you magnify your response to the everyday life stressors because you've experienced trauma, meaning abuse or neglect early in life.
Okay. Wow. That's a lot to think about. Thank you so much for that. So basically what you're saying is that our ancestors' traumatic experiences can cause us to experience PTSD or hypervigilance for events that we're not even aware of. For example, even people who were adopted, who don't know their ancestors' stories, they can still inherit a PTSD reaction to something that their grandparents had experienced.
Yeah, I don't know if I would go full on and call it PTSD, but I might call it something like an epigenetic effect on the regulatory areas of the brain that makes you more vigilant for danger, so you're more reactive, and so you create more stress internally generated because of what you've inherited. I don't know if the studies show that that person would meet the full criteria for PTSD, but it's definitely a trauma-related cross-generational inheritance through epigenetic changes of dysregulation. Let's just call it that, to be really, accurate in terms of what's actually passed along.
Okay, great. Thank you for clearing that up.
It could be PTSD, but I don't think so. I think it's just hypervigilance for danger, but I might be wrong. It could be PTSD. We should look that up, but it's definitely hypervigilance, which, you know, you experience, if it's you, as a feeling of anxiety and a tendency toward anxiety, maybe not the full PTSD, which, you know, can require flashbacks and all that kind of stuff. And that's, as far as I know, not what's inherited, but it's this vigilance for danger that has an element of generalized anxiety or panic and stuff like that.